She set the time. She just is wanting to
Yeah, and I gave one in the Center for Landscape Dynamics on the Tuesday before too. So I feel like there's probably a lot of people who've seen me talk recently, and so I tried to add in some new things as well. But there is going to be a little bit of crossover. But if people have questions, definitely feel free to ask me.
I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I need repetition typically. Like repetition is not bad. In fact, one of the things you learn about teaching as you do it a long time is how important repetition is. You know, you think you tell them it once and then they've got it and you don't have to repeat it, but I think the reality is repetition's good. So I think, well, okay. Okay, so I just make a couple announcements. So sampling is currently prohibited at Cole Farm through December 8th. This probably has to do with the hunting. Where's Brandon? Yeah. Has to do with the hunting because they let some friends or something hunt on the farm. So you always need to let Brandon know when you are going out there anyway, because Brandon has to give advance notice, but you can't go before December 8th. And then just in general, the hunters are active, so you need to be careful whether you're in Shale Hills or Garner Run. AGU participants, AGUs next week. Easy, the institute that I direct, is going to host a reception at the Baby Whale on Thursday, December 13th. Are you going to AGU? Did you get an invitation? Okay, good. Because sometimes we don't keep our invitation lists updated. It's from 6 to 8. And anybody that goes to AGU is invited. You don't have to be in our college. But we're not able to get a list. You know what I mean? It's just too hard. So, but if you're going to be there, you're more than welcome to come. It's going to be a crowded, tight party probably because it's a small bar. And then just to remind you, the all hands meeting for 2019 for the CZO is May 9 and 10. Any other announcements anybody need to tell anybody anything about? Brandon, Jennifer, anybody? Okay, so today's speaker is Sarah Ivory. She joined the Geosciences department as a faculty as of, I think, September, August maybe. And then she spent like a month in Oman and is doing all sorts of science everywhere. So she is working with Roman. They've already been doing some drilling with Joan Marie. And so I think she's going to talk about not that work, but work she's done in the past. And I think you'll see all the interactions with CZO, all the overlaps with CZO. So welcome. Oh,
okay.
She has to use it.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, so do I have to hold it sort of close, or do you? Okay, all right, I'll just hold it. Okay, so I'm a paleo ecologist, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the work that I do. So I gave a talk on Friday in ecology that was really focused on the ecological and paleo ecological component of what I do, and so now I'm gonna talk a little bit about biosphere geosphere interaction. So there's gonna be some overlap, so you get a little bit of repetition, but there should be like some new stuff as well, in particular applications to Earth system science. Oh, this worked like 2 seconds ago. Oh, did I turn it off somehow? Great. Oh, I don't know. It seems like it's still not, but this isn't working either.
Okay. Is he still here? Of course he's not.
Yeah, it's like it's stuck.
Totally frozen.
Hmm.
I have to say that Zoom is like a miracle.
So it's good work. It's working here. Is it working on yours?
Yeah, it does look like it's working. Great. Okay. Okay, so just a quick little outline. I'll start with an introduction and talk a little bit about what paleoecology and paleoclimatology can do for reconstructing ancient landscapes. And then the bulk of the talk is divided up into two sections, which represent sort of very mature research and also very preliminary research. I've been working in East Africa for over 10 years now, so I'm going to be talking about like a long arc of stuff that I've been working on, which looks at the last 600,000 years of vegetation and climate in the Great Lakes region of East Africa. And then I'll talk about very preliminary work. Like Sue said, I just got back from Oman and I've gone there several times over the last year and a half, trying to collect novel archives for reconstructing vegetation in the arid tropics. So just a little bit about me. My background originally is actually in botany. So even though I'm a professor now in geosciences, my first love was plants. And I've also done postdocs in environmental institutes and most recently in a department of anthropology. And I think you'll see that all of those like very disparate interdisciplinary foci really come together in the work that I'm interested in. So many of you have heard this quote from me before, having seen my talks, but I think it's a really good reminder of my sort of philosophy towards vegetation change and future global change. The quote is, "Present plant communities have no long history." And the idea is that because we know that species respond individually to climate, you don't have to go very far back in the past to see novel ecosystems that are structured and composed very differently than what we see around us today. And so I use these ancient archives of vegetation to give us an understanding of how vegetation might change in the future, with the idea that it might be very different. And this is just to give you a geographic sense of where I work. So the majority of my work is in large wetlands and also large lakes in the tropics. And so I'm going to be talking to you today about Lakes Tanganyika and Malawi here in the southern part of the East African Rift, and then a little bit about this Southern Arabia work. But you can see that I have a pretty strong interest in the tropics. And part of the reason for that is that we know that the tropics is already the warmest place on Earth. So when you warm the warmest place on Earth, what happens is you create climates that don't exist anywhere on Earth today. And so this is a map that shows where we expect climates to emerge that don't exist, that aren't observable today by the end of the century under about a 2-degree increase in global temperature. And you can see that the majority of these regions where you have these emerging climates are centered in the tropics, and in particular in Africa. And from the perspective of trying to project future ecosystems, it is very difficult to do that using models that are trained on modern-only data. And so this is an example from a paper that shows that, this is for a set of both species distribution models and community models, that model performance goes down as climatic distance or novelty increases. So our predictive ability of the future goes down if we don't include data that falls outside of the modern observational context. And that is not just an ecology problem, that's an Earth system science problem, because we know that patterns of vegetation and climate across space are important for determining critical zone processes from the top of the canopy down to the tips of the roots. All of these parameters that I have listed here that I'm not going to go through in detail, are like really intrinsically related to both vegetation structure and composition on the landscape, and that provide important ecosystem services and are critical parts of the landscape. So if we want to know how they are going to change in the future, we also need to understand how ecosystems will be structured and composed in the future. And so I'm going to be talking mostly about Africa, and so I want to just give you a little bit of sense of what the structural and compositional differences of the main vegetation types in Africa are. So around Lakes Tanganyika and Malawi, which are right here, the two dominant vegetation types you can split up into a lowland vegetation type, which is the Miamba woodland, and then the highland vegetation type, which is the Afro-montane forest. So the Miamba woodland occurs below about 1,500 meters above sea level, and it's the largest dry tropical forest in the world, which covers a region of about 2.7 million kilometers squared. I think it's pretty interesting because it actually is pretty species poor with respect to a typical tropical forest, but most of the species that do occur there don't occur anywhere else. So it has very high endemicity despite the fact that it doesn't have high biodiversity. And it's also really interesting from its functioning. So it's a dry season tolerant woodland But it also is really strongly linked to frequent disturbance by fire, with fire return rates of like 1 to 3 years in a lot of places. That's quite frequent. One of the dominant taxa in that forest is Brachystegia. That's its scientific name, but its local name is Miambo. And so that's where this vegetation type gets its name from. And that's this tree right here with this sort of like stilted look to it. And then so up in the highlands, above 1,500 meters above sea level, you have a very, very different type of landscape. Here you have tall, high stature, closed canopy forest, very, very high biodiversity and endemism. So high numbers of species in addition to very unique species. And very little fire. I have no fire up there. That's not entirely true. As these landscapes are being altered by people, fire becomes a more important part of the landscape. But typically in like the densest sections of these forests, you don't find a lot of fire. And we know that in Africa, there have been studies that have shown that, that vegetation structure is very important for determining at least denudation rates and erosional processes on the landscape. So this is from a recent study from 2015 that basically just shows that under these different types of vegetation, so closed canopy forest versus more of like an open woodland, that you have different scaling relationships between denudation rate and mean gradient level. So meaning that when you have a denser closed canopy forest, you have lower denudation rates than you would expect and a similar gradient when you have open vegetation. So vegetation patterns seem really important for erosional processes in Africa, and there have been a few studies in the tropics that have come to similar conclusions. And the reason that we care about these types of landscape processes, particularly in the tropics, is that there's a very, very different relationship in a lot of these areas to ecosystem services, in that people rely very heavily for basic subsistence on things like fisheries and water quality. And yet at the same time, we're in a situation now where the areas around Tanganyika and Malawi have exploding populations, and that puts increasing pressure on these food systems to provide for these burgeoning populations. And the fisheries are a really interesting example, and they're something that are kind of becoming like a future avenue of research for me as well, because we know that climate is changing the productivity of the fisheries. And so this is from a recent paper that shows that you have declining abundances of fish, which is the size of this bubble here, as temperatures increase, which is related to a decrease in primary productivity, which is this proxy for biogenic silica, which would be diatom productivity. So increasing temperatures are or resulting in stratification of these water bodies, and therefore a decline in the fish stocks. And land use is also having a really important impact as well on linkages between terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems, in that there's a burgeoning agriculture around a lot of the lakes in some of these areas. And because of some of the ways that people inherit land, they're beginning to farm on really bad pieces of very high gradient slopes. So this is actually cassava that's been planted on a slope. You can't really tell how steep the slope is, but it's really steep. And a lot of deforestation in these areas is resulting in increased sediment pollution that's having a really disastrous effect on benthic habitats, and then the pelagic ecosystems that are supported by those benthic habitats. And so this is a cichlid fish, and these lakes are also really known for their very high diversity of cichlid fishes as well. And the problem with trying to predict and therefore plan for the future is that the observational record is really short. This is a plot from the most recent IPCC that shows global temperature over the historical period, and then based on these representative concentration pathways going out to 2300. And you can tell that based on where we've been, the future is likely to be completely outside of that window in terms of its mean and its variance. So trying to predict vegetation change in climates that don't exist today really requires us to look outside of the modern in order to avoid extrapolation. And this is actually just from a recent paper that Erica Smithwick, who's a professor in geography, was also included on, that was really looking at trying to convince people that neo-research, so neo-ecological research and paleo-ecological research can really benefit from one another, in that if you integrate the results of both neo and paleo-ecological research, that you get a better representation of the processes that are in operation across various time scales. And that's just to give you a sense of what that looks like. So what types of questions can we hope to answer by using the paleoecological record? And so just to introduce you a little bit to some of these typical paleoclimatological records, these are two what I would call benchmark records of paleoclimate that cover the last 600,000 years. So the gray is global temperature from an Antarctic ice core over the last 600,000 years. And what you see are these peaks in temperatures and troughs in temperatures related to glacial interglacial cycles at about 100,000 year pace. And then the red is summer insolation, incoming solar radiation at Lake Malawi over the last 600,000 years, which is thought to be really strongly related to the intensity of the monsoon precipitation. So if we just get a sense of over the last 600,000 years and look at these oscillations, what we can do is we can look at change that occurs transiently. So if you do a space for time substitution, you don't get that transient quality. So you can look at transient change over multiple climatic cycles. And we pair that with the vegetation record. We can look at changes in vegetation at a single location. We can look at changes in distributions over space when you look at a network of spatially integrated records. We can look at changes not only in the structure or vegetation types through space, but also the composition of those vegetation types. So if you have, this is a typical interglacial in Africa in terms of the vegetation distribution, you have this tropical forest here centered on the Congo. Is that forest the same during every interglacial period, or is it composed of different species, which you would think hypothetically it very likely could be. We can look at species interactions, and then we can also look at implications and feedbacks with disturbance in this transient sense. We also have periods in the past that represent rates and magnitudes of changes larger than observed, and so we can look at the responses of species to those types of climatic changes. And finally, we have sort of a set of natural experiments that have already been run for us, in that we have a lot of past times that we know that temperature, at least globally, was warmer than it was today. And so we can use those times sort of as an analog to look at what we might expect in the future. And I think it's good to sort of conceptualize the paleo record of landscape processes within like a source to sink framework. So if you were doing a modern study and you were interested in landscape processes in like the hinterland of a basin, you would go into that basin and you would make observations and you would monitor it at really high temporal and spatial resolution. But if you want to integrate this transient long time scale process, you don't, unfortunately, have a lot of preservation of a lot of the vestiges of those processes that remain in that source area. So instead, what we can do is we can take the linkages of the source to the sink, and we can instead look at what has been deposited in this sink over time, and that allows us to reconstruct at least some of the processes that link the source to the sink and that are easily preserved in the fine-grained record. And I also said, P.S. lakes make great sinks, because they really do. And so you'll see some of that in the rest of this talk. And this is just to give you a sense about in the paleo world, we talk a lot about both archives as well as proxies. So an archive is just the physical record that's doing the recording where the signal is preserved in. And then the proxy would be the signal itself, which is oftentimes a measurement that represents, so takes the place of a state or a process in the past. And so these are just some examples of archives and proxies. I'm going to talk a lot about sediment cores today. And then I don't work on pack rat middens, I work on Hyrax middens, but the idea is generally the same. And in terms of proxies, my proxy of choice is, of course, fossil pollen. So fossil pollen work is done the old school way, sitting at a microscope, just visually identifying the morphological differences in the pollen that you see preserved in sediments. They're morphologically distinct, so that allows us to be able to separate them in the same way that you would identify a plant on the landscape. And this is just to give you a sense of, these are three trees, well, these are three plants that are really common in Africa: Brachystegia, Artemisia, and Podocarpus here on the right. And then the pollen that is produced by those plants, and you can tell that you would never mistake any of those pollen types for one another. You can always know if you find a Brachystegia or a Podocarpus. And another aspect about pollen that makes it a really powerful tool is that it's actually made out of one of the most inert substances known to man, which is sporopollenin. So it can be preserved in sediments, actually even relatively oxidizing sediments, for millions of years. And pollen abundances are also broadly representative of the abundances of plants on the landscape, which allows us to be able to reconstruct biomes and vegetation distributions through time. And this is just to show you, this is modern vegetation in West Africa and some pollen samples that were taken. And then these are the biomes that were reconstructed based on those pollen samples. And they were able to reconstruct a gradient of forest to desert based on those pollen samples. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is some work that both combines the fossil pollen record in order to reconstruct vegetation with some other independent records that look at erosional and chemical weathering processes over time. So there's a lot of material that's preserved in sediment core records, and you know, I'm trying to extract as much of that information as possible. So we can also look at charcoal, which gives us a record of fire over time. And then we can look at the physical sedimentological record as well by doing particle size analysis, which can tell us something about energy and transport. We can do identification of clay minerals that can tell us something about the intensity of weathering over time, and also calculate terrigenous mass accumulation rates, which can tell us something about sediment loading and erosion over time. So like I said, I'm going to be talking about the southern part of the East African Rift, Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi, and in particular about Lake Malawi. And the reason that these are really great archives is that they're both very ancient lakes. They're millions and millions of years old, and they have very thick sedimentary packages of many, many kilometers. So space for time substitution is very difficult in the tropics because it's very remote, it's expensive to get there, and it's not easy to go and, you know, and take an instrument and then get data from instruments. But luckily for us, because these basins are so big and so deep, that time for time is actually relatively easy. We can get very long time scale records. And I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the work that I've done in these places, but this is just kind of an example of some of the techniques that we've been using to try to characterize these landscapes through scientific drilling. So that would be long coring, short coring, doing repeat photography, doing collaborations with archaeologists, and also looking at land use history, and also some remote sensing work. All right, so I'll talk first about Lake Malawi. This is a project I've been involved in for a very long time, and it's still ongoing. The results are still coming out. So this was a scientific drilling campaign that actually the fieldwork was done in 2005. So that gives you a sense of the very long time scales, not only of building up to a project like this, but also doing the analysis and getting the results. But this is the drilling barge on Lake Malawi that was sort of constructed mostly out of shipping containers. And then these are two beautiful core images that came from that project. Okay, so Lake Malawi itself is a deep, about 700-meter deep lake. It's permanently stratified, and it's a ligotrophic lake. It has a very, very large watershed of about 65,000 kilometers squared. So this is a huge lake, about 360 kilometers or 500 miles from end to end. And this, the bedrock is mostly metamorphic basement. And so it actually is a great laboratory for looking at biosphere-geosphere interactions, because you don't have to worry about changes in source area linked to differences in bedrock spatially throughout the watershed. We drilled in two different locations, up here in the northern basin and then also in the central basin. I'm going to be talking only about the central basin core, which I'm going to call core B. I was taken at 600 meters of water depth, and it was a 380-meter core that represents the last 1.2 million years, but I'm only going to talk about the upper half of it, so the last 600,000 years. And 380 meters, just to give you a sense of how big it is like one Empire State Building's worth of sediment, so it's an incredibly long core. And I talked to you a little bit before I introduced you to some of these different proxies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the pollen record, some of the aquatic fossils, which are used to reconstruct water level, and then some of the grain size and the mineral ID as well. And this is just to give you a sense of what the clay minerals in the modern sediments look like. And so these are just XRD spectra from the northern part to the southern part of the basin, which show that you have a dominance in smectitic clay minerals, but you also have a peak in kaolinite in the north that then disappears as you go towards the south, and that's largely reflective of environmental gradients, and in particular increases in seasonality from the northern part to the southern part of the basin. All right, so this is a small stratigraphic section from just a part of the drill core. The lithology of the core is really strongly constrained by high frequency facies variability. It's related to changes in water level. And so this just represents a small section that's 3 high stand and low stands. So you have an alternating high stand and then a low stand. And the high stand sediments are really characterized by diatom-rich silty clays with many laminated sections like this one. There are a lot of aquatic fossils like fish bones and green algae, and there's a lot of charcoal preserved in there as well. And that implies you can make an environmental interpretation even just by looking at this core to suggest that this is a deep, fresh, clear water lake, much like what you see today. And that's a photo at the lake today. In contrast, the low stand sediments are very, very different lithologically. They're massive carbonate-rich clays. They also have fossils in them, but they're more carbonate-rich fossils like ostracods. They're carbonate nodules and also carbonate-coated grains, and there's very, very low organic matter, suggesting that the lake was probably not stratified during these times, and that it was much more eutrophic and frequently mixed. So based on all of those indicators that we measured and also observed in the cores, we were able to reconstruct changing water levels over time. And this just shows you this reconstructed water level as this wiggle right here over the last 600,000 years. And to give you a sense of how big some of these changes in water level are, we're actually able to constrain these by pairing the sediment core record to the seismic record. Our largest lake level regression occurred about 100,000 years ago, and that was a decrease of about 550 meters. So at the core site, there only would have been 50 meters of water where now there is 600. And then there are multiple periods prior to that where you have more moderate lake level regressions on the order of about 200 to 350 meters of a decline. And so this is the spatial extent of the lake today in blue. And during this 100,000 year time period, when you had a 550 meter lake level regression, this would be the lake right here. So again, a change from a 500-mile north to south extent to about 50 miles. So it's a huge reduction in the amount of water volume on the landscape. And also to give you a sense of the proportionate climate change that's likely to drive that, the last glacial maximum is thought in Africa to be an extremely arid time, but during that time at Malawi, there was only a reduction in water level on the order of about 100 to 150 meters. So these previous very large lake level fluctuations were also likely linked to a much larger magnitude change in climate. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about vegetation. So how does hydrologic change relate to vegetation change? This is the pollen record that I produced over the last 600,000 years. So time is along this axis right here. And then I identified over 200 different pollen taxa, but I've only put the most important ones on here that I've color-coded based on their modern vegetation association. And then right here, this is a cluster analysis that I did in order to break this pollen diagram, this very complicated pollen diagram, into zones of samples that are compositionally similar. And so if we do that, what we get on a first order is an alternation of zones that are dominated by all trees, with those that are dominated in particular by semi-arid plants, in particular semi-arid herbs. So we have an alternation over time of forests and grasslands or semi-arid landscapes. And the first thing I want to do is think about this trees and herbs, so just like the summary of the pollen, the simplest summary of the pollen diagram as a record of vegetation structure over time. And if we look at that record of vegetation structure with respect to the changes in lake level that we see over the 600,000 year period, very intuitively, what we can glean is that there's more woody vegetation when it's regionally wet. So when the lake level is near modern, you have an expansion of forest, and then when it's dry, you have an expansion of semi-arid ecosystems. So variability in landscape structure seems to follow regional hydrology. That makes a lot of sense. But I think what's really interesting is that you actually have really strong environmental gradients over time and very rapid change. So what we know is that based on our age model, that you can have a transition from something that would look like this. This is actually the area around Lake Turkana today, which is very arid. to something that looks more like this, which is in the Afro-montane forest, over the course of 200 years. So we also often have like 2 adjacent samples where you'll have a transition from high stand to low stand conditions and forest to desert over an average of about 200 years. So it's a really rapid, high environmental gradient. We've also run some hydrologic models in order to look at what type of a change in rainfall you would have to have in order to drive that large of a change in the landscape. And what we've come up with is that you have to actually decrease precipitation by over 66% over that 200-year period of time to drive that change. And so that would be a decrease from a relatively mesic tropical environment that gets about 1,200 millimeters of rainfall per year to 400 millimeters of rainfall per year. So that would pretty legitimately be a bioclimatic desert. So I talked about changes in species composition from forest to forest earlier in this talk, and that's something that I'm also really interested in. We have multiple transitions, expansions of forest. Are each of those forests created equal, or are they different each time? So in order to do that, I did this large ordination analysis with all the fossil pollen samples. So each of these dots is a sample from the fossil pollen record that could occur at any point in time. And then I've color-coded them either yellow or green, depending on whether they occur during a forest phase or a semi-arid phase. And then these arrows represent an affinity of that fossil pollen sample to a modern African biome. So if that sample falls along one of those vectors, that means that it's statistically equivalent from a pollen sample from one of those modern African biomes. And what we see when we look at the forests is that with respect to this first axis of this G-trended correspondence analysis, they're actually really tightly clustered. And what that suggests is that you actually have very little turnover from forest phase to forest phase. So species composition is relatively invariant. You could go to that pollen record and you could choose randomly 2 different samples, and they could be located right next to one another, or they could be separated by 400,000 years, and they would be potentially invariant in terms, identical in terms of their species composition. So very little turnover over time, despite the fact that you have these large environmental gradients. But also interestingly, most of these samples cluster along this vector associated with the highland vegetation, the Afro-montane vegetation today, suggesting that these fossil forests, these ancient forests, were dense, closed canopy forests that had a lot of these high elevation taxa. So these taxa that are now restricted to the higher elevations. And if we compare that to recent pollen samples and modern pollen samples from the lake, what we can tell first is, so this is where modern pollen samples plot along this biplot. And so they plot exactly where you would hope them to plot in order to be representative of modern environments. They plot right along these vectors associated with Miambo and savanna. So suggesting that modern samples are recording the vegetation around the lakeshore today, but they fall completely outside of the area represented by those fossil forests, meaning that the modern vegetation is statistically dissimilar from these ancient forests. And we can also tell that this transition from this type of a forest right here, this Afro-montane affinity forest, to a more Miambo-like forest occurs about 8,500 years ago and is coupled with an increase in charcoal inputs to the core. And so I've been looking at this with some archaeologists who have been working at Malawi. 8,500 years ago is interesting because it's also the timing of a really important expansion of modern human populations in East Africa. And we do know, so this is a map of Middle Stone Age archaeological sites, are the yellow points right here. Along the western shoreline. And we know that we have a very high density of archaeological sites that begin right before 8,500 years ago and that continue to occur up until 60,000 years ago. So as these vegetation changes were happening, there were more people on the landscape, suggesting that the presence of people may have had some link to the increased charcoal that we're also seeing in the core, and that we may have a new human-mediated fire regime during this time that may be driving some of the changes in the species composition. And another thing that's really interesting is, so we're also dating some alluvial fans that occur adjacent to a lot of these Middle Stone Age sites. And the dates that are coming back are also really interesting because they're contemporaneous with the Middle Stone Age sites themselves. So they're all dating to this 8,500 to 60,000 year period of time. suggesting not only that we have a change, an increase in fire and a change in vegetation composition, but also the inception of alluvial fan formation, probably related to increasing upland erosion at the same time. And we also see in the core, so there's also predictable changes in deep water sedimentation that happen at about these same times. So prior to 8,500 years ago, we have some low stands and some high stands. The low stands, you have an expansion of semi-arid woodlands and grasslands, and the high stands are usually indicative of expansion of forests. And we have relatively repeatable patterns in inputs of clay minerals and also grain size to the core site during these times. But that changes in the last 8,500 years. And so this pink in these ternary diagrams represents the samples that occur during wet periods of time over the last 8,500 years. And what we see is that when we have a relatively wet climate, but with woodland, so a more open landscape than you'd have under a forest, the clay minerals have a tendency to be a little bit less altered, so they're more smectites and illites, and you have very variable grain size during these times as well, but with a lot of increased sandy material, and probably indicative of mass wasting in the lake at the time. And so that's at Malawi. We have this connection between what's happening in the landscape and what's happening in the physical environment in the lake. But we also see similar relationships in other parts of the rift. And so this is some work that I've been doing at Lake Tanganyika with a similar suite of proxies. And so this is a little bit of a complicated wiggle diagram, but we have reconstructions of climate using organic geochemical techniques. So this is Tex 86, which represents temperature, and delta D of leaf waxes, which is a rainfall proxy. And then we have sedimentation rates right here, and then this chemical index of alteration, CIA, which is indicative of the intensity of chemical weathering, and then a vegetation and a charcoal record here at the bottom. And we see a really similar pattern, but on a very different time scale, in that you don't really have an increase in Miambo woodland, which is here in orange, until the early Holocene. It's preceded by fire, as it is at Malawi, and then the physical response seems to be an increase in sedimentation rates and a decrease in CIA, which would be a reduction in the alteration of material that's being delivered to the core site. And so what I would suggest is that we seem to have feedbacks between vegetation composition and structure and climate that play a really critical role in landscape dynamics in these basins. And I kind of think of it like we also almost have alternate stable states that are linked to the presence of fire, and that when you have high rainfall, you can either have forest or you can have woodland, depending on the level of disturbance. And then that type of vegetation seems to lead to reproducible patterns of deposition of clay minerals that represent intense chemical weathering under forest and reduced erosion under forest, and much more variable and higher physical weathering and fan formation when you have higher levels of disturbance and more open vegetation. So just to wrap up this section, forest composition varied very little until the Miambo emerged at Malawi 8,500 years ago. There are large environmental gradients over time, which allow us to reconstruct transiently some of these landscape processes with complete turnover of the vegetation in under 200 years. That forests were more Afromontane-like in the past, even during warm periods. And that's interesting to me because a lot of these species are thought of as not being warm temperature tolerant, but they occurred in the lowland during warm periods in the past. That fan activation and changes in weathering accompanied these changes in disturbance regime and vegetation, and that we have this really interesting feedback between climate and vegetation that may to some extent be decoupled or altered by anthropogenic change. We are continuing to do a lot of future work, in particular at Lake Tanganyika, which is partially because there's a lot of interest by managers and conservationists, especially at the Nature Conservancy, to look at relationships between the terrestrial environment and food webs within the lake. And so they're really interested in shorter time scale and also long time scale source to sink work. We're also going to be having a workshop relatively soon in May in Tanzania to start planning a long scientific drilling campaign at Lake Tanganyika as well. We're hoping to get like a 10 million year record from the lake. So that's stuff that's like still in the future and ongoing. This is just some of the work that I'm not going to go into detail about this, but we've been trying to do some shorter time scale work as well at Tanganyika to look at disturbance and linkages to sediment pollution. And so we've been trying to do short core reconstructions of sedimentation rates and vegetation and pair them with historical records of where in the basin we know there were people and that disturbance has been happening for a known amount of time versus areas in the watershed that have been largely devoid of people. So to try to constrain the impact of deforestation over the historical period. And we've also been doing some repeat photography. This is a project that I'm particularly excited about. There have been numerous Europeans who have gone to East Africa earlier in the 20th century and before that did a very, very diligent job of taking photos, marking down the locations where they took those photos, and also doing a pretty good job of recording the plant species that were occurring where they took the photos. And so we've been trying to leverage some of those records of those old photos. This is 1920, but we also have found photos going as far back as the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And then recreating, some of this has been done for us. I obviously didn't take these photos in 1957, but continuing that on into the future to look at landscape change and pair those with some of our short core records. Okay, so I am at 12:43, and so I want to talk a little bit about, I said, the more preliminary stuff that I've been working on more recently in Southern Arabia. And so I'm going to go through that pretty quickly. And like I said, there isn't a lot of exciting results. It's not going to be as data rich as the previous part of the talk, but I wanted to share a little bit with you because I am really excited about it. So we've been looking for Hyrax middens and trying to develop them as paleoecological and paleoclimatological proxies in areas where there are no lakes to act as a sink. This is a photo from the most recent field season that we just came back from in early November. This was the largest midden that we've ever found. It was very big. It was 30 kilograms, so it was very heavy. And okay, so this area that I'm going to talk about is in southern Oman, in a region called Dhofar. And then we also have some middens that we've collected from Yemen as well, which is not on this map, but I'll talk a little bit about those and I'll show a map of where those are located a little bit later. But Dhofar is a kind of interesting ecological region from the perspective that its vegetation affinities, it's most closely related to the African flora, even though it doesn't occur on the African continent. And it's the easternmost expression of the African flora. And it is this little island, which represents a biodiversity hotspot that then is surrounded entirely by desert. So Dhofar itself includes this old rift escarpment that has these cloud forests growing just at the top of the escarpment. And this is just to give you a sense of what this area looks like in two different seasons. So this was most recently when we were there in October and November, which is right after the wet season. And you can see how lush and green it is. There were waterfalls flowing. There was a lot of water in the wadis. It was a very different environment than this photo, which I took last February, right at the end of the dry season. The cloud forest is also really interesting. It has a really important keystone species, which is Anogeissus dopharica, which is a regional endemic. It has this really unique hydraulic property in that it intercepts cloud moisture in its leaves and then pumps it down into the ground. And it is actually responsible for over 80% of the groundwater recharge. And it only now occurs in this really restricted region, like just on top of the escarpment. So not over the escarpment, not down here, but just right on the escarpment. But there is some indication that its range used to be a lot more broad, which has important implications then as well for moisture recycling. So there are no lakes in Oman today, but during the mid-Holocene, about 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, there's a lot of indications that it was much, much more wet than it is today. There are old lake deposits, spring deposits, and streams way out into what is now complete desert. This was a a paper that I got involved in that actually started before I started my PhD and was only recently published. But it's looking at, this is model reconstructed precipitation over the Holocene, and then this is ages, dates of these lacustrine and swamp and river deposits. And so you can see much higher vegetation in this region 5,000 years ago, and then a precipitous decrease up until about 3,000 years ago. And the reason that we're interested in this, I'm also collaborating with some archaeologists on this project as well. And they have mapped archaeological monuments and also settlements in this area for decades now. And it's really clear that during this time, the way that people were living and the places that people were living are very different than today. And that there were transitions in livelihoods from pastoral livelihoods to agricultural and then back to pastoral as climate was changing. The animals that they were raising were different and changed through time. And so one of the aspects of this project as well is trying to tease apart the impact of the environment, not only on climate change, but also these changes in livelihoods over this complicated period of time as well. So like I said, but there's no lakes, and so we don't have an easy paleo environmental archive. So we've been going out into the desert and climbing around and going into caves and trying to find these latrine deposits of rock hyraxes. And so this is a rock hyrax right here. And yes, they are that cute in real life. And then this is me with a very big midden that we found that we just pulled out of this cave right here. So middens require really dry conditions in order to be preserved. And rock hyrax distributions have a tendency to be in somewhat mesic to semi-arid regions. And so there's been a lot of midden research that's been done in South Africa and semi-arid regions of South Africa. But up until this point, there really hadn't been anything done in Southern Arabia, and that had really stymied a lot of paleo-environmental research in the area because of the absence of lakes. But in South Africa, they've been doing this for decades, and they've managed to collect even 40,000 year records, continuous records from middens. And these are great archives because they're full of organic matter, so they're easy to date. They preserve pollen really, really well. They preserve plant macrofossils and also ancient molecules like ancient DNA and also those leaf waxes that I was talking about earlier. Up until now, there were some middens that were collected in Yemen back in 2000, back when you could still go to Yemen. And I've been working on those middens, and then we've been collecting new middens in this area. So this is this escarpment of Dhofar that I was talking about before. And outside of the Yemen middens, of which there are 23, we've collected about 124 new middens that are pretty spatially distributed from Oman. And these are just the typical places where you find Hyrax habitat. They like these little rock shelters. This is all limestone. They like these little rock shelters that you can see on these cliffs. And they'll just be networks of caves that they're kind of like hiding way back in the caves. And they have a habit where they have their nests separate from their toilets. One of my Omani collaborators always says, the Hyrax is very clean. It keeps its toilet very far away from its nest. And he seems to be right in that the nests are usually higher up and then the toilet deposits are further down. And they go to the bathroom within the caves that house their latrines over many, many generations. And so that accumulates, and then you can sample it in the same way or in a similar way to how you would sample a sediment core record. And you have oftentimes stratified deposits that come out of that. So this is one midden that was from our first field season that I cut open. You can kind of see the inside of that. The sampling is relatively simple. We disaggregate them in water and then sieve them. The coarse fraction, which includes the plants, is identified right now. This says given to Anna Lee. Anna Lee's an undergrad that is at Ohio State University who's doing some of that work. And then I've been, from the fine fraction, extracting the pollen. I've identified 125 pollen taxa so far, which is pretty high for that region, but it is actually pretty diverse, even though it's not obvious from when you look at the landscape. And we've also been doing measurements of nitrogen isotopes and carbon isotopes, as well as we have a collaborator who's trying to see if there is ancient DNA preserved in the middens as well. And that ancient DNA, we're not just interested in the plants, we're also interested in seeing if there is camel DNA or if there's cow DNA, and some of the animals that people might have been raising out in these areas at that time as well. So this is just to give you an example of some of the preliminary data that's coming out of this. Okay, so this pollen diagram is set up similarly to the previous one that I showed. This is time right here, and then each of these bars is a single midden sample. Some of them come from the same midden, and some of them come from different middens, and so I've represented them as bars. And the picture that's starting to emerge is that back during the early Holocene, like one thing I'm really focused on is this anagysis, which is this really important plant for groundwater recharge, that its abundances were very, very, very high 5,000 years ago. And that also happens at a time when there's relatively high fire, that fire is not something that is an important landscape feature today. An anagysis climatically only occurs in areas with much higher rainfall than what you see in these areas. So this is basically just to show you the amount of rainfall that falls at the midden locations today in comparison to where you find anagysis today. So it's much higher than where you find anagysis today. And there's also some evidence from this genetic work that was done that just recently, this came out in 2008, but what they saw is that there's evidence of very recent fragmentation of anagysis populations, of extant anagysis populations, such that, okay, so modern anagysis populations are the black dots on here, that it's very likely that these only became separate populations within the last couple of thousand years. And so that combined with our observation of anagysis both here as well as out here suggests that not only was this population probably continuous relatively recently, but that probably extended way out here into what now is hyperarid. And this is just to follow up in one project that I'm also trying to get started with a friend of mine who's a sedimentologist, is also to look at some of the landscape processes and how those change at the same time as these changes in vegetation. There are all these really interesting features out in the desert because it's limestone, it's just karsted like you wouldn't believe. And out in these areas where it almost never sees a drop of moisture, there's evidence of salt weathering. There are these big plunge pools. You can't really tell from this photo, but there's this plunge pool that's probably like 50 feet deep right here. And then a lot of evidence of flow stones and springs that have gone dormant as well. I don't think I'll get into a lot of detail about this, but I'm working with my friend Mike to try to make some basic observations. In February, he came with us into the field to make some observations about the bedrock and to make observations about these changes in weathering. There's gradients of weathering into the desert, using a rebound hammer to look at the hardness of the rock, and then the observations were some of these weathering processes like the salt weathering and also pitting from sand abrasion. And what we can see on a first very preliminary order is that there are sort of two gradients that we see in weathering, and one is very modern, and that's higher weathering out here in the desert and then reduced as you go towards the plateau. That's very recent because it's largely related to sand abrasion, as you have these sandstorms that come in off of the Rub al Khali, which is up here in the north. And then another gradient in weathering that's the opposite direction from the south up to the north, that's likely a lot older. And that has to do with evidence of this salt weathering that suggests that the monsoon front, which now stops right down here, likely continued very, very far out into the desert very recently in the past. And so that's something that we're kind of starting to work on. So I'm not going to go into all of this, but there's a lot of stuff that's coming out of this project and going to come out of that project as well. So yeah, that's it. Oh, I tried. I don't feel out of breath. It's good.
Can you explain a little bit more, like some species, tree species are more important for groundwater recharge, something is not?
Yeah, so that's this forest right here. So there have been studies that have actually monitored some of these populations of anogenesis that have shown that the contribution of anogenesis to recharge is more important than like direct infiltration, and that they actually are responsible for about 80% of the groundwater recharge just themselves because of the cloud water interception. Yeah.
What's the mechanism? Okay.
They're intercepting cloud water. So there's actually, instead of a typical monsoon here, so it's cold water right off the coast. So during the monsoon season, these air masses that aren't quite saturated hit the escarpment and go up, and they form really dense fogs. So it doesn't really rain per se, but you get a ton of fog. And so the only real available moisture is cloud moisture, which anogenesis is very, very good at intercepting. So, yeah.
Then it just moves through the plant across the water potential gradient.
Mhm.
So do you know anything more about the reef surface that might enable them to absorb water? Is it their follicles? Do they have?
I really couldn't tell you that. That would be something I would have to look more into.
So does that mean that normal proxies for mean annual precipitation wouldn't really work in this landscape because it's not precipitation as much as it is fog, or do they isotopically work similar?
So that's something that I've been kind of debating with also when you go back into the past, is does an increased monsoon mean fog further out into the desert, or does it mean that now you actually have enough moisture to reach saturation so that you're raining? And so that's something that we're still trying to figure out. We're using nitrogen isotopes right now to reconstruct rainfall, and I didn't show you that data because it's really, really messy and confusing. So I suspect that it is a very challenging thing to reconstruct. And so what we're going to try to do is do some biomarker work on leaf waxes, and I would think that that actually should be much more representative of effective moisture than the nitrogen isotopes. So.
The last case, it looked like the modern montane forest didn't show up in your scatter plot of sites. Is that pollen not getting to the lake, or? So
it does, but only in very, very small abundances. It is actually really interesting because I've done more, like a much larger network of sampling of modern pollen in Lake Tanganyika. And there's areas of montane forest where you're like the lake abuts an escarpment, and you have montane forest vertically within like a kilometer of the lake, and there's almost no montane pollen. And you're actually also in a national park right there, so it should be like relatively pristine, intact forest. But then when you go into the forest itself and you take soil samples, that pollen is extremely abundant. So it's not that it's not being transported and it's not being preserved, I think it doesn't disperse very well. So unless you have forest that's like really abutting the lake, it's not there. Yeah.
So they must take into account that when studying vegetation, because pollen dispersal is really going to vary depending on its aerodynamic qualities.
Yes.
So is that a typical thing people try to take into account?
Yes, it is something that we take very strongly into account, which is why, so actually there are thousands and thousands of modern pollen samples that have been sampled from virtually every African vegetation type that you can imagine that have been done in order to try to like quantitatively back correct for dispersal and productivity, because they also produce different amounts of pollen in addition to being dispersed in different ways. So, yeah.
Can you go back to the first part of your study? You were connecting fan activation, fire, vegetation, erosion, and weathering. And you were talking about it's going back and forth between dense forest and non-dense forest.
Mm-hmm.
But can you just talk about it again, like more slowly? It's kind of like your conclusions of that first part.
Yeah.
And just unpack it, but slow it down. I thought it was really interesting, but I wasn't sure that I was catching it all.
Yeah. So to some extent, it comes from this work, which is a collaboration with these archaeologists that I've been working with. So the yellow dots are these Middle Stone Age sites that date from a range between about 8,500 years ago to about 60,000 years ago. And in the core record, that's when we have a transition if it's relatively wet, we have a transition from dense closed canopy forests to more open woodlands, where we see fire being important on the landscape for the first time in 600,000 years. So those things coincide, as well as coinciding with the dates, the OSL dates on these fans. So what it seems like is happening is there actually is before, what I didn't really talk about is that before 8,500 years ago, there's actually a major disturbance in that very, very deep lake level regression occurred. So it was extremely, extremely dry. And so as it begins to wet, forest starts to establish itself. But as it's establishing itself, it appears that people are also migrating into the basin and setting fires, such that the fire intolerant tree taxa that existed in the basin before aren't able to reestablish because you have a new fire regime. And as that's happening, you also have increased rainfall that's then very effective for transporting sediment and causing some of this erosion. Does that make?
Yeah, I think so. But so, I mean, are you thinking that the humans are causing the fire? I mean, you can't prove this, but you're implying.
Yeah.
Humans are causing the fire.
Well, so we do know that people have been setting fires for 300,000 years and using fire for hunting for about 300,000 years. So we know that people were there and people were using fire for hunting. There has been some work to look at like what a threshold and number of ignitions you would need in order to do that level of landscape conversion. And it's high, like it's higher than what you get from lightning ignition sources alone. So it does suggest that in order to transform the landscape in that way, lightning isn't enough. So it's a weight of evidence. Yeah.
Okay, so but then you have fire, and then what is that doing? Is that like burning down the trees and causing more erosion?
So it's precluding some of the higher canopy, larger tree taxa that you find in the upper montane forests. And it's also keeping the landscape much more open. So that area today is probably about 20 to 60% canopy cover as opposed to 80 or more percent canopy cover. So you have more open canopy, which is going to be more effective for erosion as well. So you have less interception.
And more erosion that gives you the build out of the open field.
Yes. And also then deposition of the sandy detritus in the...
chemical weathering?
And I think that's just because the residence time on the landscape is much lower. So you have flushing into the basin of clay minerals before they can sit around on the landscape long enough to like turn into keolinite.
Okay. I just wanted to put it on.
No, that's good. That's good.
What about what you're doing in Bear Mountain? Do you want to just say a couple of minutes about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I haven't really done anything yet, but Joan Marie and Roman did some drilling, took some sediment cores, some drill cores from a hill slope in Bear Meadows, and Joan Marie has photographed them and started to do a little bit of preliminary identification of some of the minerals in them using smear slides. And then has also gone out and taken some soil cores, some very short cores from the lowest part of the environment in the wetland of Bear Meadows. And then, so eventually we're going to be, my lab isn't ready yet, so I can't do any pollen extraction yet. I know, I started this process a year ago. It's still not ready. But in any case, I'll be doing some pollen analysis and then working with Joan Marie to look at similar linkages between erosion and vegetation and climate from like over multiple timescales, right? You think that there might be multiple climatic cycles recorded in those cores?
Yeah, it's a very similar question. It's just a matter of cold tundra versus modern deciduous and how that changes the erosion processes and how the paleo environmental signatures that are perhaps hopefully stored in these soil cores can tell us not just erosion rates, but also temperature and aridity conditions.
Right. Yeah. So.
Other questions? Can I just also ask, where do you get the funding for this?
Well, so it comes from a lot of different places. Some of it has just been like fun side projects, like this collaboration with these archaeologists was just like a fun side project when I was a postdoc. The Oman work is coupled human and natural systems at NSF. The Malawi project was a combination of the International Continental Scientific Drilling Program and also NSF, because that was a really large funding endeavor. So a combination of NSF, some foundations, and then some of it was, you know, just small fortuitous collaborations. So yeah.
If not, let's thank Sarah.
Thank you.
Not this semester. Next semester. Yeah.